On July 19, 1333, the Scottish army stood at the base of Halidon Hill, near Berwick upon Tweed in southeastern Scotland, and stared up at an impossible tactical situation. 14,000 to 18,000 Scottish soldiers, representing the largest army Scotland had fielded since Bannockburn 19 years earlier, needed to march uphill across boggy ground under continuous arrow fire from 3,000 English longbowmen positioned on the hilltop, then fight uphill against fresh English men-at-arms in armour, all to relieve the English siege of Berwick. The English commander, King Edward III of England, just 20 years old but already proving himself a tactical genius, had chosen his ground perfectly. Halidon Hill was a gentle slope that forced attackers to advance across 800 yards of waterlogged farmland before climbing the final approach to English positions. Every yard of that advance would be under arrow fire from longbowmen who had clear sightlines and height advantage. The Scottish commander, Archibald Douglas, guardian of Scotland and uncle to the child King David II, understood the tactical nightmare but had no choice. Berwick, Scotland's most important fortress, was besieged and starving. If it fell, English control over southern Scotland would be permanent. Douglas had to attack uphill against longbows or watch Berwick surrender. He chose to attack. In the next few hours, English archers would systematically butcher the Scottish army, shooting thousands of arrows into packed formations, struggling through mud, killing perhaps 4,000 to 14,000 Scots, while losing fewer than 50 Englishmen. It would be the most one-sided English victory since Dunbar, a massacre so complete that it destroyed Scottish military power for years and established the tactical template that England would use to dominate European warfare for the next century. On this day, Scotland learned again the lesson of Falkirk. Courage means nothing against longbows, and attacking uphill into arrow fire is not a battle, it is suicide. To understand why the Battle of Halidon Hill was such a catastrophic disaster for Scotland, you must understand the political situation in 1333. Robert the Bruce, who had won Scottish independence at Bannockburn in 1314, died in 1329. His son and heir, David II, was only 5 years old. Scotland was ruled by a regency council with Archibald Douglas as guardian. England, meanwhile, had a new young king eager to prove himself. Edward III was crowned in 1327 at age 14, after his mother and her lover deposed his father, Edward II. By 1330, young Edward had executed his mother's lover and taken personal control of England. He was ambitious, militarily talented, and determined to reverse his father's humiliating failures. Edward II had lost the Battle of Bannockburn and been forced to recognize Scottish independence in the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. Edward III considered this treaty a humiliation and looked for excuses to restart the war with Scotland. The excuse came in 1332 when Edward Balliol, son of the deposed King John Balliol, invaded Scotland with English support, defeated the Scots at the Battle of Duplin Moor using longbow tactics, and briefly seized the Scottish throne. The Scots rallied and expelled Balliol by the end of 1332, but Edward III used Balliol's claim as justification for direct English invasion. In 1333, Edward personally led an army north and besieged Berwick upon Tweed, the fortress that controlled access to southeastern Scotland. The siege of Berwick in 1333 was brutal and calculated. Edward III arrived with approximately 10,000 to 15,000 men, including 3,000 Welsh and English longbowmen, and began a systematic siege. Berwick's garrison numbered roughly 1,500 defenders. The town was well fortified with stone walls and a castle, but Edward's siege engines and tactics were devastating. He used trebuchets to bombard the walls with stones and fire. He attempted to storm the walls multiple times, losing hundreds of men but inflicting heavier casualties on defenders. Most importantly, he blockaded all supplies, starving the garrison and civilian population. After weeks of siege, Berwick's commander negotiated a conditional surrender. If a Scottish relief army did not arrive by July 20th, 1333, and either defeat the English or enter Berwick with supplies, the garrison would surrender. This deadline forced Archibald Douglas to act. He assembled the largest Scottish army possible, 14,000 to 18,000 men, and marched to Berwick in mid-July. His plan was to bypass the English siege lines and enter Berwick from the north, fulfilling the surrender conditions. But Edward III anticipated this. He lifted the siege temporarily, marched his army to block the northern approaches to Berwick, and positioned his forces on Halidon Hill, 2 miles northwest of the town. This forced Douglas into an impossible choice: attack the English uphill or watch Berwick surrender. Douglas chose to attack, believing that Scottish courage and numbers could overcome English tactical advantages. He was catastrophically wrong. On July 19, 1333, the Scottish army formed up at the base of Halidon Hill. Douglas organized his 14,000 to 18,000 men into 4 large schiltrom formations, the same circular pike formations that Wallace had used at Falkirk and that Bruce had used successfully at Bannockburn. But there was a critical difference. At Bannockburn, the Scots had favorable terrain, including marshy ground that disrupted English cavalry. At Halidon Hill, the Scots were attacking uphill across waterlogged ground toward an enemy positioned on the crest with clear fields of fire. Douglas understood the danger, but believed the schiltroms, if they could reach the English lines, would be unstoppable in close combat. The Scottish formations were composed mostly of common soldiers, spearmen with 12-foot pikes, wearing padded jacks or minimal armor, no shields. These were farmers and townsmen conscripted to fight. They were brave, but bravery doesn't stop arrows. Supporting the schiltroms were Scottish knights and men-at-arms, perhaps 2,000 armoured cavalry who would attack alongside the infantry. The Scottish plan was simple and desperate: advance uphill under arrow fire, accepting heavy casualties, reach the English positions, and overwhelm them through superior numbers in close combat. It was essentially the same plan the French would use at Crécy 13 years later, and it would fail just as completely. Edward III's defensive position on Halidon Hill was a masterpiece of medieval tactics. The hill itself was not steep, but had a gentle slope that provided height advantage for archers. Edward positioned his approximately 10,000 to 15,000 men in 3 divisions across the hilltop. Each division had a corps of dismounted men-at-arms, knights who had gotten off their horses to fight on foot in heavy armor with poleaxes, swords, and shields. These men-at-arms formed a defensive line that could hold against any infantry assault. Positioned on the flanks of each division, and slightly forward, were wedges of longbowmen, perhaps 3,000 archers total. These were professional soldiers, many veterans of Welsh campaigns, armed with 6-foot yew longbows with draw weights of 80 to 120 pounds. A skilled longbowman could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute accurately at ranges up to 250 yards. 3,000 longbowmen shooting 10 arrows per minute meant 30,000 arrows per minute, 1,800,000 arrows per hour. The English archers had wagons of arrows behind their lines, thousands of projectiles ready. Edward's tactical plan was brutally simple. Let the Scots advance uphill across 800 yards of open ground, shoot them continuously with massed archery, and when they finally reached English lines, exhausted, decimated, and demoralized, finish them with armoured men-at-arms fighting downhill. It was the same tactical system that had worked at Duplin Moor the previous year, and that would be perfected at Crécy and Agincourt. The Scots were walking into a killing machine. The battle began around mid-morning when the Scottish army started its advance up Halidon Hill. 14,000 to 18,000 men in 4 massive schiltrom formations began moving uphill across the waterlogged farmland at the base. Immediately, the terrain became a problem. The ground was boggy from recent rain, and the weight of thousands of men churned it into mud. The schiltroms, designed to move as tight formations, began to lose cohesion as men struggled through the muck. Soldiers sank ankle-deep or knee-deep in mud with every step. The tight circular formations began to loosen and elongate as faster men pulled ahead and slower men fell behind. This was exactly the worst possible situation because it meant the Scots were no longer in disciplined formations, but in ragged crowds. And then the arrows started falling. At 800 yards, the English longbowmen began shooting. The first volleys were test shots, archers judging the range and wind. Then the serious bombardment began. 3,000 longbowmen shooting in coordinated volleys created what contemporary chronicles described as clouds of arrows darkening the sky. From the Scottish perspective, the sky above and ahead filled with black streaks descending at steep angles. The arrows fell continuously, striking randomly into the packed Scottish formations. A man walking uphill through mud would suddenly be hit in the shoulder, the leg, the back. Arrows punched through padded armor easily at this range. They struck horses, pack animals, anyone and anything in the formations. Men began falling immediately, creating obstacles that other Scots had to step over or around, further disrupting the advance. As the Scottish army struggled uphill through mud and arrow fire, the killing accelerated. At 600 yards, the arrows became more accurate and more deadly. At 400 yards, bodkin point arrows could penetrate even chainmail and light plate armor. The Scots had no answer. They had a few hundred archers of their own with shorter, less powerful bows, but these were outranged by the English longbows and achieved nothing. Scottish commanders urged their men forward, shouting that the only escape from the arrows was to reach the English lines and engage in close combat. But reaching the English lines required advancing 800 yards uphill through mud under continuous bombardment. It took perhaps 30 to 40 minutes for the Scottish schiltroms to cover that distance, and every second of those minutes, arrows fell. Contemporary sources describe the sound as like hail on a roof, a continuous rain of death. Scottish soldiers couldn't run because of the mud and the weight of their equipment. They couldn't break formation, because that meant being isolated and killed. They couldn't retreat because the arrows were falling from ahead and commanders were pushing from behind. They could only trudge forward through mud, stepping on dead and wounded comrades, waiting for the arrow that would hit them. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical casualties. Men watched those next to them be struck down. They saw arrows sticking out of bodies. They knew they were next, but discipline and courage kept them moving forward, even as the formations thinned. By the time the first Scottish schiltroms reached the base of the final slope up to English positions, they had lost perhaps a third to half their men to arrow fire. Thousands of Scots lay dead or wounded on the approach, the ground behind the advancing formations littered with bodies. The survivors, exhausted from struggling through mud, wounded and psychologically shattered, now had to climb the final slope and fight armored English men-at-arms who were fresh, positioned defensively, and fighting downhill. The Scottish assault hit the English lines with negligible force. Men who had just survived 30 minutes of arrow hell and climbed 800 yards through mud had no energy left for combat. They struck the English defensive line and were repulsed immediately. The English men-at-arms, standing in solid formations on firm ground, fought with poleaxes and swords against exhausted Scots who could barely lift their pikes. The Scottish pike formations, which worked when soldiers were fresh and in tight formation, were useless when the men were scattered, exhausted, and demoralized. The English simply held their ground and killed Scots who struggled up to them. Meanwhile, the English archers continued shooting into the packed masses of Scots, still approaching from downhill. The arrows never stopped. Even when Scottish soldiers reached the English line and engaged in melee, archers shot into the Scottish rear ranks, killing men from behind while they tried to fight to their front. The Scottish assault lasted perhaps 2 hours of continuous struggle up the hill under fire, then collapsed completely. The schiltroms broke. Men who had endured the arrow storm and reached the English lines without breaking through began to retreat, then to run. Once the retreat started, it became a rout. Thousands of Scottish soldiers turned and fled back down Halidon Hill. But retreating down a muddy slope under arrow fire is as deadly as advancing up it. English longbowmen shot fleeing Scots in the back. Men fell face first into mud and drowned. Others were trampled by their own fleeing comrades. The English cavalry, which Edward had held in reserve, now charged down the hill pursuing the routed Scots. This was not a pursuit for glory, it was systematic slaughter. English knights rode through fleeing Scottish formations, cutting down men from behind. The pursuit continued for miles. Scottish soldiers who escaped the hill were hunted through the surrounding countryside. Some fled toward Berwick, others toward Scotland. Many were killed trying to cross the River Tweed, drowning in armor or cut down on the riverbanks. The slaughter lasted until nightfall. By the time it ended, the Scottish army had effectively ceased to exist. The casualty figures at Halidon Hill are disputed because different chronicles give wildly different numbers, but even the most conservative estimates indicate a catastrophic Scottish defeat. Contemporary English sources claim 14,000 Scots were killed. Modern historians consider this an exaggeration, estimating between 4,000 and 8,000 Scottish dead. But even the low estimate represents half the Scottish army killed in one afternoon. The high estimates suggest that as many as 14,000 Scots died, meaning nearly the entire Scottish force was destroyed. Among the dead was Archibald Douglas himself, the Guardian of Scotland, who was killed during the retreat. 5 Scottish earls were killed. Hundreds of knights and nobles died. Scotland's military leadership was devastated. English casualties were minimal, perhaps 30 to 50 men killed, almost all in the brief melee when Scots reached the English lines. The casualty ratio was perhaps 100 to 1 or higher, making Halidon Hill one of the most lopsided battles in medieval history. The battlefield after the fighting was a vision of hell. Thousands of Scottish corpses covered the slope of Halidon Hill and the approach ground. Many bodies had multiple arrows protruding from them, evidence of the sustained bombardment. The mud was stained red. The River Tweed was choked with bodies of men who drowned trying to escape. Berwick, which the Scots had died trying to relieve, surrendered to Edward III the next day. The strategic consequences of Halidon Hill were immediate and crushing for Scotland. The Scottish army was destroyed. The Guardian was dead. The Scottish nobility was devastated. Scotland had no organized military resistance left. Edward III imposed his puppet king, Edward Balliol, on Scotland and seized control of southern Scotland, including Berwick. The English occupation would last for years. Scotland's independence, won at such cost at Bannockburn just 19 years earlier, was effectively lost again. It would take another 14 years, and the outbreak of the 100 Years' War between England and France, to allow Scotland to eventually expel the English and restore independence. But the immediate aftermath of Halidon Hill was complete Scottish subjugation. The battle also had broader military implications. Halidon Hill confirmed the tactical lessons of Duplin Moor and Falkirk. English longbowmen on defensive terrain could destroy any attacking force regardless of numbers. This tactical system would become the foundation of English military success for the next century. 13 years after Halidon Hill, Edward III would use the same tactics at Crécy against the French, killing thousands of French knights with longbow fire. 82 years after Halidon Hill, Henry V would use the same tactics at Agincourt. Halidon Hill was not just a Scottish defeat. It was the confirmation of a military revolution, where ranged weapons and defensive tactics trumped traditional cavalry charges and pike formations. The human cost of Halidon Hill was measured not just in the thousands of dead soldiers, but in the families and communities they left behind. 4,000 to 8,000 Scottish men killed meant that every town and village in southern and central Scotland lost people. These were not professional soldiers, but conscripts, farmers and townsmen who had been called to defend their country and died in mud under arrow fire. The economic impact was severe because those men were also labourers whose deaths left farms untended and families impoverished. The psychological trauma affected Scotland for years. Halidon Hill joined Dunbar and Falkirk in Scottish national memory as proof that conventional battles against England were unwinnable. This created a strategic culture of guerrilla warfare and avoidance of pitched battles that would characterize Scottish military thinking for decades. The captured and wounded Scots who survived the battle faced grim fates. Those with money for ransom were imprisoned until payment arrived. Those without money were enslaved or executed. The English treated the survivors as rebels and traitors, not as honourable enemies. Archibald Douglas's body was recovered and buried, but many Scottish nobles died anonymously on the slope of Halidon Hill, their bodies stripped by looters and buried in mass graves. The tactical details of Halidon Hill reveal why the Scottish assault was doomed from the start. The 800 yards of waterlogged ground at the base of the hill meant that Scottish soldiers were exhausted before they even reached the main slope. Medieval soldiers in armour carrying weapons and struggling through knee-deep mud would be completely drained after covering that distance. The sustained arrow fire meant that the Scots were taking continuous casualties throughout the approach. The gentle slope of Halidon Hill meant that English archers had clear sightlines for the entire Scottish advance. There was no dead ground where Scots could shelter or rest. The height advantage meant English arrows shot downhill had greater range and impact than arrows shot uphill. giving the defenders overwhelming firepower superiority. The Scottish schiltrom formations, which worked well on flat ground against cavalry, were useless when advancing uphill through mud under fire, because the formations couldn't maintain cohesion. Every tactical factor favoured the English, and Douglas had no tactical options to counter them except to attack anyway and hope that Scottish numbers and courage would overcome English advantages. It was a hope, not a plan, and it led to catastrophic losses. The mythology around Halidon Hill in Scottish culture is complex because it represents another humiliating defeat by English longbows, similar to Falkirk and Dunbar. Unlike Bannockburn, which is celebrated as Scotland's greatest military victory, Halidon Hill is remembered as a disaster that temporarily destroyed Scottish independence. The battle doesn't feature prominently in popular Scottish historical narratives because it doesn't fit the narrative of heroic resistance, but military historians recognize Halidon Hill as crucial because it established the pattern that would dominate Anglo-Scottish warfare. Scotland could not defeat England in conventional battles if the English used longbow tactics. This forced Scotland to adopt alternative strategies, including alliance with France, guerrilla warfare, and avoidance of pitched battles. The eventual Scottish success in maintaining independence came not from military victories like Bannockburn, but from English distraction with the 100 Years' War against France and from political compromises. Halidon Hill taught Scotland that courage was not enough against longbows, a lesson paid for with thousands of lives. On July 19, 1333, 3,000 English longbowmen positioned on Halidon Hill butchered 14,000 to 18,000 Scottish soldiers advancing uphill through mud. The Scots lost perhaps 4,000 to 8,000 killed, including Guardian Archibald Douglas and 5 earls, while the English lost fewer than 50 men. It was a massacre, not a battle, where Scottish soldiers died by the hundreds, with no chance to fight back, shot down by arrows they couldn't avoid while struggling through terrain that exhausted them. Berwick surrendered the next day. Scotland's independence was lost again. Edward III proved himself a tactical genius at age 20. The longbow's dominance over medieval warfare was confirmed, and Scotland learned once more that attacking uphill into massed archery was suicide. The Hill of Arrows had butchered Scotland's army and would haunt Scottish military planning for generations. Courage, numbers, and determination meant nothing against longbows, terrain, and tactical genius. On that July afternoon, English archers killed thousands of Scots who never had a chance.